place of a reading today, we will watch a brief film produced by the New York Times interview of one of the ministers who accompanied James Reeb to Selma during the Voting Rights March.
This was 1965. I was in Berkeley. I saw on television the terrible Bloody Sunday. Just incredible to me that in our society there should be such violence, public violence as that. I knew something was wrong, and I wanted to speak up in some way, do something. The next morning, I heard on the radio Martin Luther King asking clergy to come to Selma the next day. I arrived in Montgomery, and I remember the drive across the countryside, about 55 miles. I remember seeing large billboards saying Martin Luther King is a communist, never having been in the South before. And I knew I was in a different country, as it were. I looked around and saw Jim and Orloff, and we decided, the three of us, that we would try to have dinner together. They had arrived earlier in town, so they had an orientation about how to behave, nonviolent. If someone attacks you, don't attack back. We went to the restaurant, an integrated restaurant, just for that day. When we decided to leave, Jim telephoned to his wife, Marie, to tell her that he would not be back home that night. And the three of us then started walking back to the Brown Chapel. We saw 3 or 4 men who came across the street at us. We saw that one of them was carrying a club of some kind. We whispered to each other, just keep walking. They were right behind us, and I turned and looked at them, and I saw one of them, the one next to Jim, right behind Jim Reeb, swing a club, just bang, hitting Jim on the side of his head. Orloff fell to the ground in that prayer for protection position, and I ran. One of the attackers ran after me and slugged me, hit my face, knocked my glasses off, and then went away, and so did the others. Jim was lying there, babbling, incoherent, and he squeezed my hand tighter and tighter, and then I felt his hand go limp, and he went unconscious. He never recovered his consciousness. I began to realize that we were the center of attention, that this was a big event. The next morning, they brought us back to the hospital, and immediately I noticed there were yellow roses there that had been sent by President and Mrs. Johnson. Thousands of people gathered in various cities, Washington, Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco. It was headlines all across the country about the attack on this white clergy. But the whole voting rights march, that is the march from Selma to Montgomery, was originally organized to honor Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young black man who had been killed by a state trooper. But there wasn't much attention paid to Jimmy Lee Jackson by the broader American public, nor by the president. I learned years later that in reference to Jimmy Lee Jackson's death, President Johnson had not one telephone call. He didn't initiate one, didn't receive one. In reference to the attack on Jim Reeb and his death and so on, Johnson had 57 phone calls.
This minister's going to die, isn't he?
Yes, sir.
What time do you think he'll die? They tell me that he could stay alive for another 24 or 36 hours.
57 phone calls. It has struck me that that's an extraordinary number, no matter what the situation might be. 57 phone calls. I believe that Johnson was moved by the attack on us and by Jim Reeb's death. The president realized that this was the moment to urge passage of the voting rights bill. And in his speech, he said something to the effect that there are times in history that are special moments in man's unending quest for justice and freedom.
So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed.
So he made specific reference to Jim Reeb, whose hand I'd held when he went unconscious.
Really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
I'm past 80 years old now. This happened to me when I was 33 years old. The gift to me in my later years, and having been part of this, it's an enormous gift to me. Part of, not all, but part of the meaning of my life.
So in this first picture, I'm going to show you, James Reeb has the clergy collar on. Now last week we had the lyric, "Ain't no one gonna turn me round," right? Well, he was turned round on that slide. See, they kept trying to have this march, and he came for the second try, and that's how that song lyric comes, because the troopers would be there. And if you go back to that slide for a second, Louise. Back. Oh gosh, we're going the wrong direction. Oh well, okay. I'll take it. Well, anyway, I'll tell you more about that. I'm going to ask you some questions at the end of this sermon, and you can come answer them with me about 10 to 15 minutes after the service ends, and Atherton Hall will have tea with Rev D. For James Joseph Reed, the road to Selma began years earlier, and some of these are his years earlier pictures, where he started volunteering for boys' clubs. He started volunteering at different churches. He felt like the service was more important than the denomination from an early age. And this military picture, he ended up joining the Army, and even there he was quite pastoral. And he came, however, from Casper, Wyoming. And he went to the high school there, and he was constantly looking at ways that he could do things justly. So he went into the Army, and that gave him the money to go to college. And he met Marie, this is Marie with some of their children, before he went to college, but it was always known that they would get married after, and they did. So this is some of their children. Next. He's another one of the famous martyrs that's in all the different murals. You can see him there next to Martin Luther King. Next. Jim was always more interested in chaplain work than preaching, and he was looking for the kind of fit where he could really make a difference, especially in urban neighborhoods. And he used his college time to start examining faith as well. So next. Another one of those murals. Next. After he went to college, he went to seminary, and his first placement was at All Souls, DC, which even today is one of our very premier cutting-edge congregations. And you can see how beautiful it is. That's the building they're in now, and were in then, but they had other buildings before that. It was a president's congregation as well. So this was a big deal that James Reeb got selected to be first the assistant and then the associate minister there. Next. You can see in this one, on the left there, you have Viola Liuzzo is the only woman in that picture. And then James Reeb has the glasses on next to him. And Jimmy Lee Jackson is the black man on the far right. In the center is, of course, Martin Luther King. Next. You can learn a lot about him in books. You can also sign up for the podcast class to learn more about this. So this is one of the books that's been written about him. Next. Now these were some of the pictures that he was seeing on TV, as well as Viola Liuzzo. Now she actually died a couple weeks after him. And we did this in this order because of the women's music we had last week. So she came after this. He died first. But they both were seeing these images with their families. Next. And here's the Edmund Pettus Bridge, so we'll talk about that. You can pause the photos for now. We'll come back. So James Reeb was really interested in people and their problems. That was his first tendency. And as he became more and more interested in people and their problems, as opposed to God being his first kind of motivation for things, he began to shift away from Presbyterian theology, which he went and studied a number of things, and then when he encountered a group of Unitarian Universalist ministers, he asked if he could get credentialed in our faith. So he didn't grow up UU. And he and Marie had attended various Unitarian churches, and in the spring of 1959 is when Reverend Duncan Howlett, who was the senior minister at All Souls Church, he's the author of that book on James Reeb that I just showed you. That's when he met up with James Reeb and had an immediate board meeting. I found the guy for us. We have to hire him. Board, please act. It was a very, very exciting time. And James Reeb thought this would be great because he would be working in the Shaw area of Washington, D.C. He knew he could really affect change. And he said in one of his sermons, James Reeb, at that beautiful church that I just showed you, he said, "If you came here this morning hoping to hear a message of hope, in many ways I will have to discourage you." This is actually from the final sermon he ever gave. There were many people who feel that once we had a March on Washington, once we had the Civil Rights Bill, things would inevitably just go back to the way they were, but be easier, be better, that somehow we'd done it. And all I can say to you is that the most dangerous kind of thinking is this kind of delusion, that we have not in any way done it. We are seeing in many states voting rights being curtailed. Where I live in Wisconsin, we have seen a huge curtailment of how much you can vote, who can vote, the hours, and whether they'll count it. We have a Supreme Court case that's coming up where they're going to allow states to review the popular vote and decide if they are certifying it or not. So now all our voting for national elections could end up going the way that your state governors and state representatives determine. It's really scary. So James Reeb said, "It's delusional to think we have already done it. And just to the extent that we think we have, we're going to be dismayed when we found out we have not." And just to the extent that we permit ourselves to be emotionally dismayed, we ourselves as individuals will in some way add to this thing known as the backlash, which is real and I feel many ways growing and in many ways possibly stronger than we surmise as yet. Couldn't we say those words today just as he did in the congregation in Washington, D.C. when he said that? 8 months after he delivered that sermon, he went to Selma, Alabama to show support for the voting rights campaign there. Less than 24 hours later, he was attacked on the corner of Washington Street by a group of men he'd never met before. And he died 2 days later in Birmingham, which you may notice is a good 60 miles from Selma. So if you want to know more about that, sign up for my class. We're going to have a great class listening to almost like a thriller mystery called NPR's White Lies podcast, and it's just about all these events around James Reeb's death and actually helped solve some of the mystery around it. Jim would have not wanted to be remembered as a martyr. As profound and moving and important as the story of his death was, like Viola Liuzzo, he was so much more than what people killed him for in the end. I am reminded, I just spent the weekend with the board and we did our first retreat and I got to hear so much about you. So I'm reminded about letters that you have been writing and have written in the past. I learned about how many of you became voter registrars. In fact, I saw Dan today still carries his card. He can sign you up on the spot here. So he was really working on expanding rights. And even though All Souls UU in DC was one of the most important churches in the denomination, and frankly it still is, and I urge you to go and listen to some of their sermons today and find out what they're like, James Reeb's job there was enviable. Us ministers would have said that was a plum pulpit to get, right? But he was restless with it. He felt the comfortable position at All Souls was in conflict with the values that he preached, and that the turbulence of the early 60s and the beginning of the civil rights movement, he saw growing inequality and injustice all around. He was singularly dedicated to the high concern for all people from all walks of life. Dr. Howlett, Reverend Duncan Howlett says, this concern expressed itself among the poor living near the church, most of whom were Negroes. And this was a man with fresh ideas and bright intelligence, original and yet had an extraordinary amount of modesty. You'll learn more if you listen to the podcast or join us in class about how he ended up deciding to leave All Souls despite how regarded it was. He wanted to encourage community more directly to work outside the walls of the church. As we enter this period of transition in this church right here, you'll hear about when ministers are looking for a church. We're trying to get the transitions office to kind of help us figure out like what might be a good match. And James Reeb had this same problem. And the transitions office, the UU Department of Ministry kept saying, we assure you that we will get your name on desirable church lists. And James Reeb said, if there is anything I'm not interested in, it is joining the list of those looking for desirable churches. What the hell is a desirable church, he said. I mean, here was the crux of the matter. If we're serious about the kind of religious and political community that we seek, what are we doing to nurture it? You'll find footage of James Reeb explaining how he needed to step up to be in places where few white people were found. He was keenly aware, even then, over 57 years ago, that by going into spaces where you have more privilege than others, you can leverage that to help the people with less privilege at that moment. So he was dedicating himself to that. He really didn't fixate on one particular issue. He kind of saw how they all came together. And if you aren't aware, this is a time in social justice in the world right now where people are realizing that having justice issues in silos as individual things actually never gets to how they all relate together. And a word that's come into vernacular invented by Kimberly Crenshaw is intersectional. How issues of race are also issues of the environment, how issues of housing are also issues of schooling or clean water. Reeb was a leader before his time of this kind of thinking. In fact, he and his family illustrated walking what you talk. They got rid of their comfortable life in DC. They took a pay cut. They went in favor of living their faith. The White Lies podcast describes, after months and months of searching, Jim began to feel that really any church with its institutional structures and all the administrative responsibilities would interfere with the community organizing that he felt called to do. So he took a job in Boston for the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, working on low-income housing and issues. He had a storefront office. If you know, the Roxbury neighborhood at the time was majority was black. Jim and his wife moved their children into a neighborhood in North Dorchester, one of the main thoroughfares in what they called the ghetto then. Boston was ripe for a pilot project to assess how low-income families needed better housing. And they wanted to be very clear that it wasn't going to be this one denomination telling them what to do. Instead, it had to be a partnership. It had to work with people, not for people. You may have heard of programs where those of means become the helpers, and then they sort of become the saviors, and you might even hear of the savior complex, right? This was not that. This was living amongst the people, asking them first what they needed, and being in relationship with them, true partnership, rather than assuming that they knew best. James Reeb was so successful that in the 8 months that he lived in Boston, he made so many connections. He has journal entries you can read of who he met, and I was sitting there reading them this past couple of weeks going, these could be now. Like, they're the same people. They just, back then. On the first Sunday in March 1965, Jim brought his children to Sunday school, and that afternoon in Selma, Alabama, a human drama was unfolding that would touch and transform all of their lives. Jimmy Lee Jackson was the first martyr. More than 500 Negroes marched for the right to vote that day, and when they met the Alabama state troopers, they asked if they could pray, and instead the troopers beat them. They doused them with tear gas, and they made sure they were incapacitated, and that was all filmed on national news. James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo were watching with their families. On Monday morning, Dr. Martin Luther King sent telegrams to all the religious groups across the continent. It read, "In the vicious maltreatment of the defenseless citizens of Selma, where old women and young children were gassed and clubbed, we have witnessed the eruption of the disease of racism, which seeks to destroy us all. It is fitting that all Americans help bear the burden. I call, therefore, join me," he says, "join me in Selma in this way that all Americans will testify that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy in our land." Now, you saw in the interview with Reverend Orloff Miller, and he reflects, if you read further on it, that at the time, the Unitarian Universalist Church was very much removed from the black community in the North or the South. Kind of like now, there's some congregations that have adopted the 8th principle, and they've gone through a process of that, and some think they'll never do that, and there's debate about it today. At that time, there was debate in congregations, UU congregations, of whether they should support civil rights or not. And Reverend Orloff says, one of the things I had to recognize was that the UU Church was an upper-class church. Certainly was very much so at the time. In fact, the congregation in Birmingham, Alabama, was not in sympathy with the demonstrators. Miller says, but Selma changed that, because before we were done with Selma, and Selma was done with us. Half of our entire denomination of ministry was involved. So Jim learned about the plea from King about noon that day, and by 11 p.m. he was on a plane, and he met up with Reverend Orloff Miller and Reverend Clark Olson. And I'm going to take some slides again. So here's the beatings. Next. More. That's the Edmund Pettis. That's him marching. The first time he went down there, they tried again. So a second time they tried to march. Next. I told you about Brown AME Chapel last week, right? Next. So this church was used as the hub for everything because there weren't many safe places where people could even gather to have a meeting or talk. The white protesters that came could not eat at white restaurants. They had, and also by principle, they went and spent their money at the black businesses where people were allowed. In those days, those were integrated cafes and other businesses because they had to have a place for everyone. Next. This title on this Life magazine, The Savage Season Begins, felt so haunting to me. Next. This is the Walker Cafe. So this is one of the couple places that they could get food. And so when they went in there that day, there were actually a number of UU ministers. Most of the UU ministers that came down were involved on college campuses. They had more community ministries. There weren't that many parish ministers coming down, but there were more than just these three I mentioned. So this is the Walker Cafe, and it's about a mile from the AME church. So think about, like, you need to go get lunch, you're walking a mile to go get lunch. Next. Now, they decided that it was shorter to turn right out of the cafe. So the cafe is there in the background, like where those people are. And they decided to go right, which was a little bit more deserted, but more direct of a route to the AME church. And they didn't make it very far. They made it about 50 feet. Next. Now, if you listen to the podcast, the White Lies podcast, you take the class, you're going to hear a lot about the Selma bail bonds place. So this building is still in business. I took this picture in August. That cafe is, 100 or some feet away. And between the two spots is where the men were beaten. Next. And this is James Reeb in the ambulance or in someone's car. They were trying to get him medical help. There was no medical facility in Selma that would take him. You could only get medical care from places where they served the black community if you were one of the protesters. You couldn't go to the nearest hospital. Next. And he indeed did die, and you'll learn more about that next. This is his family. Johnson set a plane for them to get down to Selma for the memorial. Quite different than Viola Liuzzo, right? So she got shamed, and James Reeb got lifted up. Next. They did catch 3 men, and for decades and decades, the story has been that 3 men were beaten, but that's not entirely true. Next. You can see how Life magazine changed its tune after James Reeb was murdered. Suddenly they become more palatable, more for it. Next. And eventually the march did happen. That's the one a few weeks later that Viola participated in. Next. Here's Johnson making that speech. Next. People began to protest all over the country. James Reeb's death was one of those watershed moments, we say. The water ran over. Next. The eulogy was given at James Reeb's funeral by Martin Luther King. Next. Next. they got permission to march from AME Chapel to the front steps of City Hall and place a wreath for James Reeb. It was a big deal. By that point, Johnson had ordered that the protesters be protected. Next. Here's another scene from Boston. Next. Here's inside the church. You can get a feel for how big it is and what it looks like. Next. More. Next. People were so touched that they went and marched by Marie and Jim's house in Boston and would salute his home. Next. And here's Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act. Next. There were many people that came to pay tribute. Next. Next. This is in front of AME. So this is in front of the church. They now have this monument, and it has Jimmy Lee Jackson, Viola Liuzzo, and James Reeb, a tribute to them in front of the AME church, because that's been so central to the civil rights movement. Next. These are all pictures I took in August. Next. Next. There's, do any of you get mailings from the Southern Poverty Law Center? I always got those mailings. I just figured it was a civil rights group. At their offices in Montgomery, Alabama, they have the Martyrs Memorial and a small Martyrs Museum there. So James Reeb and Viola are featured there, and this is the monument that was designed by Maya Lin, who's famous for the Vietnam Memorial. Next. If you do go to Selma, there are remembrances all over, and there's also monuments to the Ku Klux Klan and the Confederacy. You'll find that all over Alabama. The two will be right by each other all the time. Next. Next. You can see James Reeb is up there on the right. Next. So I hope you would join me for the podcast class. Thank you. That's the podcast you'll listen to, and we'll have great discussions. We're done with the slides. So I talk a lot about the podcast because it's another way to deepen your understanding of UU history. And when you understand where you come from, you have a better chance to affect where you're going. So the more I've been studying all these, I find myself asking questions like, would I have gone to Selma had I been called by Dr. King? I think I probably would have. But I wonder what I would have done when I got there. And I wonder, every time I go to a protest, or every time I write a letter, or every time I pick up the phone to call someone in our government, I wonder, will my effort make any difference? Would I have worried about what my impact would be, or would I have simply answered the request of a great man to come help? The martyrdom of James Reeb produced the most widespread reaction against the doctrine of white supremacy in all of the turbulent history around civil rights movement. Here was this patiently good man who died, Martin Luther King said, for doing good. And what was critically important is that he was a white man, a family man, a sober and industrious man, and a religious man. That combination was overwhelming in its impact on white consciousnesses. And for the first time, many whites could see a simple, crystal clear issue, the right to vote, could identify through the death of a white man with the Negro cause. So there was this surge of conviction that swept the nation. You know, President Johnson used it. He was quoting Martin Luther King in his speeches. He wrote, "It's wrong, it's deadly wrong to deny any fellow Americans the right to vote. We have already waited for 100 years and more, and the time for waiting is gone. We shall overcome," said President Johnson, quoting Martin Luther King. Now, knowing what we know now, how often do I or do you do or not answer the call of love because we're not sure if it'll make a difference? How do we ever know what will be the drop in the bucket that causes it to overflow and bring on that watershed moment? The board and I spent these 2 days together talking about key moments in the history of this congregation, and we realized that all the things that people are the proudest of about this took risk. It took being in the unknowing. It took being uncomfortable. And it might be the thing that makes a huge difference. You just have to try. You have to take those risks. You have to be uncomfortable. You have to have humility because the world needs you. Our world needs us. Unitarian Universalism needs you. I need you. We need each other.